Hola, personas. Welcome to week 25 of Vivas. And today we are talking about one of my favorite things in the world, cookery, medieval cookery. So yeah, it's an exciting topic. Food always is exciting. And yeah, let's jump into it. Before we jump into this week's Viva, just a little PSA. If I'm breathing like during the video, it's because I can't physically take a breath, so I'm trying to get air, and I sound like I'm a demon that's taking its last breath. So sorry about that, but I can't get my inhaler yet, so it's just gonna be like this for a while. Okay, so today our question is what does medieval cookery tell us about their world, the medieval world? So, although we often think of food as a very trivial and minor aspect of our human experience, food culture reveals an enormous amount about the society from which we come and from which the food comes. So medieval cookery reveals the era's fascination with hierarchy in secular and sacred aspects of life. So the three things that medieval cookery tells us about medieval times is first that there was a class division. There was a big role of the church in the kitchen, and that people's understanding of health in their bodies can be seen through the medieval cookery. So, firstly, medieval cookery reflects a deep class division within medieval society. So I'm sure you guys know about the hierarchy that is really prevalent in the medieval world. And this can be seen in their food as well as just their daily lives. So aristocrats in medieval times, in the late medieval times, there was a threat to the aristocrats when the middle class grew and was able to copy the foods of the aristocrats and was able to afford things that aristocrats could afford. So the aristocrats combated this by warning against the dangers of eating outside of your appropriate class. And sumptuary laws limited the commoners with their banquets and all these things. So it made sure that the aristocrats were up here and everybody else stayed down here in everything, even their diets. So noblemen ate fresh meat and fish and vegetables and fruits, and everything was heavily spiced. And a lot of people think that medieval people use spices to cover up bad meat, but this is actually false, because why would you waste these lavish and expensive spices to cover up bad taste? It's like taking a Big Mac and trying to mask the taste of a Big Mac with white truffles. It's just a waste of good products, and it's not what the medieval people did. The noblemen kind of used spices to show off their wealth, and so they used things such as cardamom and cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger to show off these expensive lavish spices which they could afford. Ingredients such as sugar and almonds were also something that a lot of noblemen ate because this was another sign of their wealth. And I already touched on spices, but spices were a huge part of the nobleman's diet in medieval times. There was even in the royal court a department dedicated to spices called the spicery. And sauce making out of a lot of spices was a professional career. So yeah, spices were really big in this time, and people, noblemen liked to have a story that was going behind their food. So these expensive exported spices, they named spices with names like birds of paradise. So it like no birds of paradise. That's a yoga pose. I'm sorry. It's not birds of paradise. It's grain of paradise, which is a spice that they would use, and this was exported from either Asia or Africa, and they would have this narrative behind their spices and their foods, and it was a very extravagant ordeal. In contrast, we have the lower class who had a lot simpler of a diet. They did not have access to as much fresh meat and game, and lower class people would often only have meat that could be easily preserved. So they would have things like bacon and pickled herring and preserved fruits and stuff like that. And a lot of poor people kept animals such as pigs, because pigs could forage in the forest by themselves and they didn't need a lot of care or food, and so they would use these pigs for eggs. What am I saying? I was thinking bacon in my head, but I said eggs. They would use these pigs for like meat. Duh. I'm such an idiot. Okay, so yeah, and they also had cows. Poor people had cows that they would get dairy products from, such as buttermilk and milk and butter. So yeah. So we see the deep class division in the food of the medieval people. And then the second thing that medieval cookery teaches us is that the role of the church had a big role in the kitchen. So a lot of Christians nowadays don't realize just how much the church calendar affected the medieval person's diet, because we have lost a lot of the fasting that comes in the church calendar. So for the medieval people, about 1/3 of the year, they were not allowed to eat meat. And animal products were prohibited during fasting seasons, such as Lent. So we, as modern Christians, a lot of us don't practice these fasting in the church calendars, but we really have to understand just how big of a role the church had in how the medieval people cooked and ate. So Fridays were fast days a lot of times in both Western and Eastern churches in Europe, and during some fasting seasons, meals, you were reduced to only one meal. So yeah. And most Christians respected the dietary restrictions that came in the church calendar, but others found ways to violate them and not pay penance for this. So rich people would purposely eat butter during Lent, and they would just basically hand the church some money to be allowed to keep eating butter, and they wouldn't have to do any penance. And so there was these things constructed called butter towers that were basically these like fancy towers attached to cathedrals that were made with all the money from rich people who wanted to eat butter during Lent, and they just paid the church a tax, and they were allowed to eat butter, and the church made a tower out of it. And shoot, I lost my quote. Bridget Ann Heinschen says that it is the nature of man to build the most complicated cage of rules and regulations for himself. Lent was a challenge. The game was to ferret out the loopholes. So the butter towers is one example of this, Bridget says. So yeah, the church restricted and really informed the medieval person's diet, and we often think of like meat alternatives and like dairy alternatives as a modern thing, but it actually goes back all the way to medieval times, because during these fast seasons, people would get bored of just having the same things over and over. So they would make meat alternatives out of fish, which they were allowed to have, and they also made eggs out of almond milk and fish roe. So they found loopholes, they got creative, and yeah, people think that almond milk and oat milk are something new, but actually people in medieval times were using these to substitute for the dairy and meat which they couldn't consume because of the restrictions placed on them by the church and the calendar. So yeah, that's the second thing that medieval cookery tells us about medieval society. And then the third thing that we learn is that the medieval view of medicine is reflected in how they cooked and ate. So the 4 bodily humors informed a person's diet. Chris France says that dating back to the Greek physician Galen, humoral theory dominated early to mid-medieval medicine and thus cuisine. The concept that living things contain 4 elements corresponded in the kitchen to the cooks need to. End quote. So basically, Chris France is saying that this humoral theory dominated medieval medicine and informed their cooking and their eating habits. So I'm running out of time to tell you all about the humors, but basically what you need to know is that medieval people thought of their bodies as ovens. So a cook would start the process by cooking the food, and then your stomach would finish cooking the food. And yeah, that's how they thought of the digestive system and how you ate. So in order for food to be properly cooked, it was important for the stomach to be filled in an appropriate manner. So you would start with the more easily digestible foods in your meal, and then you'd move to harder digestible foods. And it was a really interesting and like laid out, detailed process so that your stomach could cook the food and absorb the food and digest it better. So yeah, medieval cookery tells us 3 things about medieval society. First, it tells us that there was really firm class division. Second, it tells us that the church had a big role in the kitchen. And third, it tells us that about people's understanding of medicine and their bodies. Thanks so much for bearing with me as I trudged through that Viva. Hope you guys are having a good week. I know I have survived this week almost, so yeah. Hopefully I get this breathing thing fixed because it's really annoying. Okay, bye guys. Do you guys remember that